The crunch of gravel under the tires of my old Ford F-150 used to be the sound of coming home. For 25 years, that sound meant the end of a long day, the smell of dinner, and a family waiting inside. But today, turning into the driveway, something felt off. Something was wrong. The wind was chasing dead leaves across the yard, and the air had that sharp, cold smell of November coming on fast. The kind of smell that always sent me to the workshop to get the house ready for winter. But there was another smell in the air today. Fresh pine, but not the lumber I'd left stacked, and a sharp chemical tang I couldn't quite place. My pickup, rusted but faithful as an old hound, came to a stop by the porch. I sat for a minute, my hands resting on the steering wheel. Knotted, calloused hands that knew the weight of every tool, the grain of every piece of wood. These hands had built this house, not in a figurative sense, literally. I'd poured the foundation, set the rafters, laid the shingles. My wife, Mary, God rest her soul, used to bring me lemonade in the summer heat and say I wasn't building a house, but a fortress. I guess she was right. I just didn't know that one day I'd be the one cast outside its walls. The first thing I saw was the new fence. A cheap chain-link fence strung up hastily around my workshop. The same workshop my own father had built before me. It stood a little ways from the house under a big oak tree. To me, it wasn't just a shed. It was a sanctuary. A place that smelled of cedar, motor oil, and honest work. A place where time moved differently. I got out of the truck. My knees popped like dry twigs. 65 is when your body starts settling accounts without asking your permission. I walked over to the new fence. The door to my workshop was ajar. I heard a soft whine from inside. Just then, my son, Mark, stepped out onto the porch. He was 40, but he still had the look of a teenager trying to act like a grown-up. He wore an expensive fleece jacket his wife, Sarah, probably bought for him, and the expression of a man about to deliver bad news with a smile. "Dad, you're back." "Great," he said, walking down the steps. "We've got a surprise." "I see that," I said quietly, nodding toward the fence. "What is this?" "Oh, that." "Well, come on, you gotta see for yourself." I didn't move. I just looked at him. My son. I taught him how to hold a hammer once. His small hand could barely wrap around the handle. He gave up on it pretty quick. Said it was boring. Now he was a project manager at some company. I was never entirely sure what that meant. Sounded like he sent a lot of emails. Sarah came out of the workshop. She was holding a leash, and on the other end of it was a huge dog, a German shepherd, young and full of energy. The dog pulled, and Sarah nearly lost her grip. "Tom, meet Caesar," she beamed. "Isn't he handsome? He's a purebred. We got him from a breeder. He has papers and everything." Caesar sniffed my jeans and gave a happy yip. I looked past him, through the open door of the workshop. It was all wrong. My old workbench, the one that had belonged to my father, was shoved into a back corner, piled high with bags of something. The floor, which should have been covered in sawdust and smelled of wood, now had dog bowls for food and water. The air was thick with that sharp chemical smell, dog food and disinfectant. The walls were covered in cheap plastic paneling. My tools were nowhere in sight. I felt something inside me break. Slowly and silently, like a tree falling in a forest miles away. "What did you do?" I asked. It was my voice, but it sounded hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Dad, what's the big deal?" Mark stepped in. "We just optimized the space. You know Sarah's wanted a dog forever, and he's too big for the house." The workshop was just sitting here empty. Empty. That word hit me like a fist to the gut. I was in there every day, fixing things for neighbors, building furniture for the grandkids, just sitting in the quiet when the house got too loud with their lives. It was my place. The only place I had left that was truly mine after Mary passed. My tools? I asked, my eyes still fixed on the plastic-covered walls. Oh, we packed them up neatly, Sarah said, cheerful. They're over there, in the corner, in boxes. We put a tarp over them so they won't get dusty. I walked inside. The smell was an assault. It was the smell of an invasion. In the corner, there were indeed cardboard boxes. My chisels, my planes, my saws, all of it just thrown in together. I saw the handle of my old hammer sticking out of one. My father had held that hammer. Its hickory handle was worn smooth by thousands of hours of work. It fit my hand perfectly. It had fit his. Now it was sticking out of a cardboard box like a tombstone. We figured it'd be more convenient for you, Mark continued, following me in. You won't have to trip over all this stuff. It's nice and open now. I was silent. I was at a funeral. The funeral for my workshop, for my life, for my place in this home. And my family were the smiling morticians who didn't even know what they were burying. There's one more thing, Sarah said, with a slight, almost embarrassed hesitation. My brother Richard is coming to stay for the weekend. Remember him? Anyway, he'll need the couch in the living room. I turned to her. I waited. So, we were thinking... It's so spacious in here now, she said, gesturing around the empty space. We'll set up your old cot in here. You can just stay out here for the winter, okay? It's too busy in the house anyway, and you love the quiet. She said it like she was doing me a favor, like she was offering a 5-star suite, not a cold shed that had been turned into a dog kennel. Stay out here for the winter. The winters here are brutal. The workshop had no real heat, just an old electric space heater that chewed up power and barely warmed the air 2 feet in front of it. I had slept in the house, in my own room, for 40 years. What about Caesar? I asked quietly. He'll be right here with you, Mark said, his voice bright. You won't be lonely. I looked at their faces. My son's face, his wife's face. They weren't joking. They genuinely had no idea what they were doing. They were looking at an old man they were putting up in a doghouse, and they thought it was a normal, practical, optimized solution. I didn't say anything. I just nodded. What was there to say? Yell? Accuse them? That wasn't my way. I'd spent a lifetime learning to be quiet and get things done. I guess I'd been quiet for too long, so long that they'd stopped hearing me, stopped seeing me. I had become part of the furniture, an old armchair you moved to the shed to make more room. That evening, they brought out the cot, an old, creaking thing with a sagging frame. They threw a thin mattress and a single worn blanket on it. They wished me good night and went back into the warm, bright house, a house I was now on the outside of. I was left alone. Well, not entirely. Next to me, Caesar curled up in his new den. He whined softly in his sleep. I sat on the edge of the cot and pulled my hammer from the box. The cold, familiar weight of it settled in my palm. Knew I'd end up a ghost in my own family photos. I'd have bought myself a boat, not built them a house. I looked at the lights in the windows of the home that was supposed to be mine and felt like the loneliest man on earth. The wind was picking up outside. Winter was just beginning, and I was supposed to survive it out here, alone in a kennel, with a stranger's dog, in the ruins of my own life. I was a quiet man, and in that quiet, a cold, calm anger began to burn. That first night was the longest. The cold crept through the thin walls of the workshop, through the single blanket, through my old flannel shirt. It wasn't just outside. It settled deep inside me, in my bones. The cot groaned with every small movement, a soundtrack to my misery. Caesar, the dog who now owned the space by right, slept fitfully. He'd twitch and whine, and every sigh was a reminder of where I was. I lay there with my eyes open, staring into the dark. But I wasn't seeing the darkness. I was seeing the past. It was here, in this room, mixed in with the smell of dog food. It was bleeding through the plastic panels my kids had nailed up to hide the place's memory. Right here, by this window, my father's workbench used to stand. I was 10 when he first put a hand plane in my hands. It was heavy, cast iron, with a blade sharp as a razor. "Tom," he'd said, his voice low and steady like the hum of a forest. "Wood's alive. Even after it's been cut, you gotta feel it. Don't force it. Listen to what it tells you." His big rough hands would cover mine, guiding me as I pushed the plane across a pine board. And I listened. I heard the thin, transparent shaving curl up perfectly. I felt the wood yield, becoming smooth and warm under my touch. That day, I learned that making something with your own two hands was a kind of magic. Real magic, not the stuff you see on TV. My father died too young, a bad heart. He left me this workshop, his tools, and one simple rule. A man isn't remembered for what he said, he's remembered for what he built. I lived by that rule my whole life. Right on this spot, where Caesar's water bowl now sits, I built a cradle for my first grandson, Leo, 20 years ago. Mark and Sarah were newly married then, living in a rented apartment. I made it out of cherry wood, smooth, solid, with little birds carved into the sides. It took me 2 months. Every minute I wasn't on a construction job, I was in here. Sarah cried when she saw it, said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Where is that cradle now? Probably in an attic or sold at a garage sale. It was probably taking up space. Money. It always came down to money. I was never a rich man, but I was a worker. An honest, hard worker. I was a mechanic at the local garage. Up at 5, home at 6, hands stained with grease. Every cent I earned went into this house, into this family. When it was time for Mark to go to college, there wasn't enough. I had an old '68 Ford Mustang, cherry red. I'd spent 10 years restoring it, right here in this workshop. It was my dream. I'd pictured myself driving it cross-country when I retired. I sold it. Didn't even think twice. Sold it to a dealer for half what it was worth because we needed the cash right away. Mark said, "Thanks, Dad." Just that. "Thanks, Dad." And he left. He got his degree, his project manager title. The Mustang was gone, like a puff of smoke. A dream I'd traded for his future. A fair trade, I told myself. A man provides. A man sacrifices. I shifted on the cot. The screech it made was so loud that Caesar lifted his head, his intelligent eyes looking at me. "You still here, old man?" he seemed to ask. I reached out and scratched him behind the ears. He licked my hand. Maybe Mark was right. At least someone was glad to have me around. Another memory surfaced. 5 years after college, Mark and Sarah wanted to buy their first house. They didn't have a down payment. I had just started putting a little money aside for my own retirement, a small nest egg I was guarding fiercely. Mary was already sick then, and I knew we might need it. But Mark looked at me with those eyes. The eyes of a son who believes his father can do anything. I gave them the money, every last dime, told them it was a gift. "Get on your feet, kids," I told them. "Your mother and I will be fine." They bought the house. 2 years later, Mary was gone, and we hadn't had enough for some of the better treatments at the end. I don't blame them. Not entirely. But sometimes, on cold nights like this, the question echoes, what if? It's a wound that never quite heals. It doesn't hurt all the time, but if you poke it, it bleeds. I got up off the cot. My legs were stiff. I walked over to the boxes of tools and took out the hammer again. I tested its weight in my hand. The heft of it was reassuring. It was real. It wouldn't betray me. I had been the pillar, the one you don't think about until the roof starts to leak. I paid their bills when they were short. I fixed their car on weekends. I drove the grandkids to school when they were too swamped. I did it quietly. I thought they saw. I thought they appreciated it. I never asked for thanks. God, no. I just asked for a little respect. The quiet kind of respect one man gives another, knowing what his life has cost him. I was wrong. They didn't see. To them, it was a given, like the air they breathed. You don't thank the air for being there. You just breathe, and they just took my time, my strength, my money, my dream, and now, my last refuge. I was silent for 20 years, I thought, looking at my own tired reflection in the dark window, but I guess I swallowed more than I should have. I went back to the cot and lay down. The cold didn't feel as sharp now. A different kind of fire was starting inside me. Not the warm, comforting fire of a hearth, but a cold, clear flame. The fire of understanding. I wasn't a victim of circumstance. I had let this happen. My silence, my patience, my endless for the family. They hadn't seen it as strength. They'd seen it as weakness, as permission. They hadn't just moved me to a shed. They had shown me my real place in their lives. I wasn't the patriarch, the father, the grandfather. I was a resource, and the resource had been depleted. Now I could be decommissioned, stored in the corner, like an old, useless tool. I closed my eyes. Tomorrow was a new day, and for the first time in my life, I didn't know what I was going to do. But I knew damn well what I was not going to do. I was not going to be silent anymore. Winter clamped down on our small town with a vengeance. Snow fell for weeks, burying the roads and rooftops. It was blinding white during the day, and at night it glowed a dead, blue color under the single street lamp. My workshop became an icebox. The electric heater hummed constantly, racking up the utility bill, but it gave off about as much warmth as a lit match. In the mornings, the water in Caesar's bowl had a crust of ice on it. I settled into a new routine. I'd wake up from the cold long before dawn. I'd do a few squats to get my blood moving. Then I'd walk to the house, quietly, like a thief, so I wouldn't wake anyone. I'd use the bathroom while they were all asleep. Sometimes I'd manage to make myself a mug of cheap, instant coffee in the kitchen. Those were the most humiliating moments. Me, in my own house, tiptoeing around, afraid of making a sound. The family acted as if nothing had happened. They got used to it. They got used to seeing me emerge from the shed in the morning like some kind of hired hand. They'd say hello, ask how I slept, and then immediately forget I existed. They were living their lives, warm, comfortable, and full of plans. Christmas was approaching. Sarah dove into preparations head first. The house filled with the smells of pine needles and baking. The smells of a holiday where I felt like a stranger. The second blow, the one that becomes the point of no return, didn't come all at once. It built up, like a snowball rolling downhill, and it finally hit me on Christmas Eve. It started with the grandkids. Leo was 15, and Mia was 12. They lived inside their smartphones, in a world I couldn't enter. One evening, I was sitting in a corner of the living room, trying to get warm after another day in the freezing workshop. They were on the couch, snickering at a phone. I didn't pay any mind until I heard a familiar sound. Caesar's whining. I listened closer. It was a recording. Then came my cough, the squeak of the cot, and then some voice distorted by an app squeaking, "Welcome to Grandpa's 5-star hotel. We've got free Wi-Fi if you stand by the window, and a 24/7 roommate." They'd made a video, a TikTok, a short clip titled, "When Grandpa Moves into the Doghouse." It showed my cot, Caesar's bowls, a shot of me asleep in my clothes. They'd set it to some stupid upbeat music. I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't just a childish prank. This was a public shaming. They were broadcasting my pain for their friends to laugh at. They had taken my private misery and turned it into content. I stood up and walked over to them. They looked up, and the laughter died on their faces. "Delete it," I said. My voice was low, but hard as frozen ground. "Grandpa, chill out," Leo tried to joke. "It's just for fun." I said, "Delete it, now." There was no remorse in their eyes, just annoyance at being caught. Mia tapped something on her phone. "Fine, it's gone," she muttered, not looking at me. I knew it was a lie. Once something is on the internet, it's there forever. I walked back to my corner. Something inside me had been burned to ash, but that was only the beginning. The real knockout punch came from Mark and Sarah. On Christmas Eve, with the house full of Sarah's relatives, they called me into the kitchen. Sarah closed the door. Mark looked nervous. "Dad, we need to talk," he started. "I'm listening." "Look, Sarah and I have been thinking about the future. I want to quit my job. I can't stand it anymore. Sarah came up with a great business plan. We want to open a small coffee shop downtown." I was silent. I knew where this was going. "We need startup capital," Sarah continued, getting straight to the point. "And we figured it out. This house. It's worth a lot more now than when you built it. We could take out a second mortgage and start our business. This is our chance, Tom." I looked at them. They weren't even trying to hide their greed. They didn't see a home full of memories. They saw a sack of cash, an asset. "The house is in my name," I said slowly. "Exactly." Mark jumped in. "That's the thing. We can't do anything without you. So we had some papers drawn up. You just sign the house over to us. It's a formality. We're family, after all." He put a folder on the kitchen table. I looked at the folder. Then I looked at their faces. There was no doubt in them. No shame, just impatient expectation. "And me?" I asked. "Where do I live?" Sarah put on a caring smile. "We've already thought of that. We found a wonderful place for you. A small apartment in a senior living community. They have on-site care, 3 meals a day, activities. You won't have to worry about a thing. It'll be so much simpler for everyone." Simpler for everyone. Meaning, simpler for them. In that instant, something inside me snapped. A clean, sharp sound, like a dry branch breaking underfoot. This was the end. The end of my patience. The end of my silence. The end of playing the part of the kind, forgiving old man. I looked at my son. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He knew. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he was doing it anyway. So, you want me to give you the house I built and move myself into a retirement home so I won't be in your way, I said. I wasn't asking, I was telling them how it was. My voice was flat, empty of all emotion. You've already given my workshop to the dog. Dad, don't be so dramatic, Mark said, his voice laced with irritation. This is about business, about the future. No, I said. You're talking about business. I'm talking about betrayal. I picked up the folder from the table. Without opening it, I walked over to the trash can and dropped it in. The kitchen fell silent. Mark and Sarah stared at me, their mouths open. They had not expected a fight. They thought I was already broken. I'm not signing anything, I said, turning to face them. This house is mine, and as long as I'm alive, it will stay mine. This conversation is over. I walked out of the kitchen, straight through the living room, full of their laughing guests. I didn't see their faces. I was moving through a tunnel. I stepped out onto the front porch and into the freezing air. I grabbed my old jacket off its nail. I put it on and walked away from the house. I didn't know where I was going. I just walked down the snow-covered street. The snowflakes melted on my face, mixing with tears I couldn't feel. They hadn't just asked me to leave. They had tried to erase me. First from my workshop, then from my home. And next, I suppose, from their lives. They wanted me to disappear quietly, leaving them with everything I had spent decades building. But they had made one mistake. I wasn't broken. I was angry, and my anger was cold, hard, and sharp as the steel of my best chisel. That night, I stopped being a victim. That night, I decided to act. I walked until my legs ached. The town was asleep under its blanket of snow. The Christmas lights in the windows seemed to mock me. I ended up at Joe's, the old 24-hour diner. The flickering neon sign was the only sign of life on the dead street. Inside, it smelled like burnt coffee and bacon. Mavis, a woman my age who'd been working the counter since the dawn of time, was wiping it down. She'd known me since I was a kid, coming in here with Mary. "Tom, what are you doing out on a night like this?" she asked. "Just walking, Mavis. Pour me a coffee." She set a chipped mug in front of me and filled it with coffee as black as tar. I sat there, warming my hands on the mug, watching the snow fall outside the window. I was calm. There was no storm inside me anymore. Just a complete, ringing silence and clarity, the kind of clarity that comes when you have nothing left to lose. I stayed at the diner for a couple of hours. By the time I walked back to the house, all the lights were off. They'd gone to bed. They probably figured the old man would blow off some steam and come to his senses. That in the morning, I'd come back, apologetic, and sign their papers. I didn't go to the workshop. I walked into the house. A floorboard on the porch creaked, and I smiled. I'd never gotten around to fixing that board. Now I was glad. Every sound in this house was mine. I went up to my old bedroom, the room they hadn't touched, because it was still filled with Mary's things, things I could never bring myself to sort through. I sat down in the old armchair by the window. For the first time in months, I wasn't in the shed. I was home, and I was going to take it back. The next morning, I didn't speak to anyone. I was up before them, dressed, and gone in my old pickup. My first stop was the bank. I withdrew what was left of my savings. It wasn't much, but it was the money I'd put away for a rainy day. Well, it was pouring. Next, I drove to my old friend, Bob Ackerman. Bob was a lawyer. We'd played high school baseball together. He wasn't one of those fancy lawyers in a shiny suit. He was a regular guy who helped other regular guys. His office was on the second floor above the hardware store. I told him everything, no emotion, just the facts, the workshop, living out there all winter, the TikTok video, the demand that I sign over the house. Bob listened, tapping a pen on his desk. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me. Tom, I always said you were too good a man for your own good. They crossed a line. What do you want to do? I want my house back, Bob, and my dignity. We can have them evicted. Legally, it's your house. They have no rights to it other than your permission to live there. No, I said. That's too easy. And too loud. I want to do this my way, quietly, but firmly. We sat in his office for a few hours. Bob drew up the papers, and I just stared out the window, thinking. I didn't feel vicious. I didn't want revenge. I wanted justice. The simple, man-to-man kind. You want to treat this like a business transaction? Fine. We'll do business. I got home that evening. Mark and Sarah were in the kitchen, looking annoyed. Where have you been? Mark asked. We were worried. Taking care of business, I said, and walked past them into the living room. The next day, late in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was a courier. He handed Mark a large envelope. What's this? Sarah asked. Mark tore it open. His expression slowly changed, from confusion to shock, from shock to fury. What is this? He hissed, turning to me. I was sitting in my armchair, reading the paper. Read it out loud, I said calmly. I'm curious too. Mark started to read, his voice shaking. Inside the envelope were 2 documents, prepared by Bob. The first was an official notice. It stated that, effective the 1st of next month, he and Sarah were required to begin paying rent for their occupancy of the house at 17 Maple Street. The amount was set at the fair market rate for a 3-bedroom house in our area. The alternative was to vacate the premises within 30 days. The second document was even more interesting. It was an invoice, a detailed, itemized invoice. It listed the down payment I'd given them for their first house, now formally classified as an interest-free loan. It listed the cost of Mark's college tuition, which I'd paid for by selling my Mustang. It included an estimated cost for all the home repairs I had done for them over the last 15 years. The total was substantial. The document concluded by stating that I expected them to present me with a payment plan to begin settling this debt. Dad, have you lost your mind? Sarah screamed, her face twisted in rage. You're sending us a bill? Your own family? You're throwing us out on the street, Mark echoed. Me? I lowered my newspaper and looked at them. No, I'm just getting my assets in order. Isn't that what you wanted? You're the ones who said this house was an asset, that it should be put to use. So I'm using it. I'm renting it out. And debts, kids, are meant to be repaid. Or did you think differently? They stood in the middle of the room, waving the papers like white flags. But this wasn't a surrender. It was a panic. The world they had built on my kindness and my silence was crumbling around them. But this isn't how a family acts, Mark sputtered. And putting your own father in a dog kennel for the winter. Is that how a family acts? I asked quietly. Making funny videos about it? Trying to trick him out of his home and ship him off to a nursing home? Is that what you call family? They fell silent. There was nothing to say. For the first time in years, I wasn't just talking. I was hitting back, with the force and precision of my old hammer, right in the place where I assumed their conscience ought to be. You have 30 days to make a decision, I said, getting up from my chair. You can either start paying your own way, or you can start building a life for yourselves. Without me, my services as a free resource are no longer available. I turned and walked toward the stairs. "Where are you going?" Sarah asked, her voice lost. "To my bedroom," I answered without looking back. "I need to get some rest. It's going to be a busy day tomorrow." As I climbed the stairs, I could hear them whispering behind me, their voices a mixture of anger and fear. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt relief, like I had finally set down a sack of rocks I'd been carrying for 20 years. That night, I slept in my own bed, a warm, soft bed, for the first time all winter, and I wasn't cold. The chill that had lived inside me was gone. In its place was a hard, calm certainty, the certainty of a man who had taken back his home and himself. The next 30 days felt like a cold war. The house was filled with a thick, tense silence. Mark and Sarah tried to pretend nothing had happened, hoping I would change my mind. They'd try to make small talk, offer me coffee. I kept my answers short and polite. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just waiting. They called relatives, complaining, painting me as a tyrant, an old man who'd gone crazy. A few of them called me. I explained the situation calmly. Not all of them understood, but I didn't care. I was done playing the game of what will people think. After 2 weeks, they realized I wasn't backing down. The negotiations began. They tried to bargain down the rent, asked me to forget the debt. "Dad, we can't afford this," Mark would say. "We don't have this kind of money." "Then you'll have to move out," I'd reply. "Might have to find a better job. Or maybe Sarah will have to put her brilliant business idea on hold and get a job like regular folks." It was cruel, and I knew it. But I could no longer afford the luxury of being kind. Kindness without respect is just a doormat. Finally, they caved. They agreed to pay the rent. Reluctantly, grudgingly, but they agreed. They understood that the street was a real possibility. They chose not to mention the debt for now, but it hung over them like a storm cloud, and I knew they hadn't forgotten it. The first thing I did after they signed the rental agreement was go to the workshop. "All right, Caesar, out you go," I said to the dog, who just wagged his tail. The dog was moved into the house. He was their problem now. I threw the workshop doors wide open, letting the frosty air pour in. I wanted to air out the foreign smell, the smell of humiliation. Then I got a crowbar and started tearing out the cheap plastic paneling. It came off in satisfying rips, exposing the old, familiar wooden walls beneath, marked with old nail holes and pencil measurements. These were the scars of memory. My memory. I worked for days. I cleared out everything that wasn't mine. I scrubbed the floors. I moved my workbench back to its rightful place by the window. I arranged my tools neatly on the wall, each one in its proper home. My old hammer, with its worn hickory handle, took its place of honor. The workshop was mine again. And as I worked, I realized something important. I didn't want to live here anymore. Not in this house. It was tainted. The memory of the last few months was too strong. I wasn't going to kick them out. They would pay their rent, and that would be justice enough. But I needed my own place. A place with no ghosts. I started looking, and I found it, a small cottage on a lake, an hour out of town. It was old and run down, but the foundation was solid. And most importantly, it had a 2-car garage I could turn into a new workshop. And it had its own dock. I bought it with the cash I'd taken from the bank and the first month's rent from Mark and Sarah. When I told them I was moving, they were stunned. "What? You're moving out?" Sarah asked. "What about the house?" "The house is still mine. You'll live here, and you'll pay me rent. I'll stop by once a month for the check." If something breaks, call a plumber. I'm not your handyman anymore. I left at the beginning of spring. The sun was getting warm, and the snow was melting from the rooftops. I loaded my tools and my few personal belongings into my old pickup. I didn't say goodbye. I just got in my truck and drove away. In my rearview mirror, I saw them standing on the porch of the house I built for them. They looked lost. Maybe in that moment, something finally clicked. Or maybe not. It didn't matter to me anymore. I hadn't been fighting for their love. I was fighting for my own respect. And I had won. My new life had a different smell. It wasn't the smell of sawdust, but of damp earth, pine resin, and fresh water. The first thing I did wasn't to fix up the house. It was to set up the garage. And then I bought something I'd dreamed about my whole life. It was an old wooden boat. Leaky, paint peeled, rotting away at someone else's dock. The owner was selling it for pennies, for firewood. I bought it, and I began to restore it. In my new workshop, I worked slowly, taking my time, enjoying the process. I listened to the wood, just like my father taught me. I patched the holes, sanded down the old paint, and coated it with fresh varnish. I wasn't alone. My new neighbors started to drop by, old guys like me, fishermen, retired military guys. We'd drink coffee, stand around in comfortable silence, and watch me work. Sometimes one of them would offer a piece of advice. It was simple, manly company, built on doing things, not on talking about them. There was no big finale to this story. No tearful reunions. No sweet forgiveness. Mark called a few times. His voice sounded different, quieter. Maybe he was starting to understand. Maybe not. I was in no rush to decide. One summer afternoon, I finished the job. The boat, which I had named the Mary, floated by the dock, gleaming with fresh varnish. It wasn't perfect, but it was solid. It was alive. And it was mine. I pushed off from the dock and motored out to the middle of the lake. I cut the engine. It was silent. Just the sound of water lapping against the hull and the distant cry of gulls. I reached into my toolbox and took out my old hammer. I wasn't going to build anything with it. I just set it on the seat beside me. The sun was setting, painting the water gold and red. I sat in my boat on my lake next to my new home. I was by myself, but for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't lonely. I was at peace. I had built a house for my family. Now, I had finally built something for myself. And it turned out to be the most important construction of my entire life.